So anyway, I chose to speak about two areas of my own experience because I've been both an ordained. I am an ordained minister of the United Church, as well as a senator in the government of Canada. So I had the experience of the religious community plus the political experience. Before I was appointed to the Senate, of course, I was very active in the NGO sector, so that public policy is formulated not simply by political parties and by the political process, but also by what we do as NGOs, and we want to talk about that. Although tonight I'm going to concentrate more on religion and politics, a slightly more narrow subject. And it's different according to different levels of government. I recently had a call from Joe Mahevic at City Hall, who said he was surprised that he didn't hear from one church when the cuts came for the libraries and the pools at City Hall and transportation, and he didn't hear from any of the churches, and he kind of wondered why. So that's one level, is City Hall. Then there's the province, and then there's the feds. And my own experience has been mostly at the federal level. As you know, both the USA and Canada have the separation of church and state. Ours is not written down, theirs is in stone. And I find the really ironic thing is, although they constantly carp about this, most of their fights seem to be about religion is interfering in the matters of the state. They have long fights about whether the Ten Commandments is allowed here, whether they're allowed to say a prayer here, and so on. And we kind of stumble on, nothing written down, but it's there. How to bring together, or what is the relationship, if you like, between religion and public policy is what I want to talk about tonight. I have a slight advantage if I'm speaking about the federal level in the Senate because, again, I was not elected, so I didn't have to answer to constituents. So I could make my own judgments, but I learned some things there about faith and responsibility to the people as well. I think a lot depends on what your concept of religion is. A few years ago, I met Sarah Polley. She's the film director of Away From Her. I don't know if you know that name. Anyway, she came up to Thunder Bay to visit my daughter, and I met her that time. And so the president of the beach decided that this was worthy of taking her on a tour of Lake Superior. So we got on this boat, and we were on about 30-foot swells, bouncing around on Lake Superior. Suddenly she says to me, "Do you consider yourself a religious person?" And I thought, oh dear, this is not the time to say, "What do you mean?" And so I just said yes. And then we had a very fruitful back and forth. But do you consider yourself a religious person? It's a very good question. And what does that mean? That normally I'd come back on a person and say, what do you mean? Do you mean, do I pray a lot? Do I read the Bible a lot? Do I go to church a lot? Etc. Or do I define religion more in terms of love for my neighbor, working with the poor? In other words, the social implications of it, or is it both, which I think it is. Remember in 1983, the World Council of Churches had its 6th Assembly in Vancouver, and people from all over the world came. And Archbishop Tutu arrived at midnight. That man has a great sense of drama and theater. And we were freezing cold. We're all sitting there waiting for him. Suddenly he appears as if he's the Messiah. And he comes in, and he grabs a Bible and he holds it up and he says, "You people brought us this book. Did you think we wouldn't read it?" It was at the height of apartheid, of course. And what he was saying is that the biblical narrative has enormous implications for how people live, and particularly for that state of apartheid, which is a highly political issue. So I think that the separation of church and state, whether it's written or whether it's assumed or whether it's practiced, was to protect religion, not to eliminate it from the public sphere. And we're in danger now of it slipping from protection of religion to really eliminating it. Just the very simple things. For example, at state dinners now, no blessing is ever said over the food. You just go like pigs to the trough. I mean, there's no acknowledgement that the food came from anywhere except the kitchen. And I regret that because you don't have to be Christian to say a prayer to give thanks, but there's no returning of thanks. And somehow there's the elimination of any religious ritual except For the Aboriginal people, which is a significant exception, and I'm not sure why. I don't know how many smudge ceremonies I went to in Ottawa. I was there. They seem to be privileged to do theirs, but not the rest of us. Well, anyway, my reading of the biblical narrative is that public decisions flow from one's ethical and spiritual formation. And we all have ideas about how we should live together in just and compassionate ways. And that, I think, is informed by our faith. Again, my reading of the biblical narrative is it's highly mixed in with economics and politics, the whole thing. I mean, even in the Christmas story, you've got Herod, a very political head of an empire. So again, you've got the political element immediately. You've got the prophets, Amos, Jeremiah, Hosea, and so on, who spoke to the king, and we're not shy about giving advice. So it mixes religion with the political and economic affairs of people all the way through. And there's more about that in the Bible than there is about sexual ethics. And if you don't believe me, you should reread it. This used to be on the Canadian scene well. Back in the 80s, when I was moderator of the United Church, the Conference of Catholic Bishops used to issue policy statements, and one particular I remember on the economics of Canada, which really, boy, did that raise hell. It was, the Prime Minister condemned it. Why didn't you go back to your cathedrals? This has nothing to do with you. Get religious and keep out of politics. But I think they were quite right, because what they were addressing was the implications of economic policies in the light of their faith. So what they were doing is that their faith informed those policies. And I think that needs to continue. And out of then, of course, came, as you know, in the 80s from Latin America, the preferential option for the poor, and the liberation theology of the Latin American Catholics, which influenced all of us so much. And we talked about the poor and the oppressed and the marginalized people, and that turned a lot of us around in terms of what we understood the religious life to be. My own tradition had somewhat of the same, but it's not as noticed. It came through Wordsworth, who was the inventor, I suppose, of the CCF party, which came before the NDP, and he was a Winnipeg Methodist minister, and he established in the north end of Winnipeg, which is where the poor lived in the early 30s, missions that he called Stella Mission, Sutherland Mission, and so on. And when I was about 18, I went down to work in Stella Mission, and it was my kind of baptism into the real world of the poor. And out of that came the NDP party eventually. And so my own church, as you may know, has frequently been accused of being the NDP at prayer. That's no longer true, but it was for some time, because so much of the impetus of the NDP party out of the West came along with the church union of the United Church, which was happening in 1925. So it was the same kind of thing. And I discovered when I visited the prairies, thank you for adjusting that. Is that better?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, you missed all that good stuff I said. Dear. When I used to visit in Saskatchewan, when I was moderator, they'd take me first to the credit union and then to the co-op, and then if there was time, they'd take me to meet the mayor and the dignitaries. but they had it firmly in their genes, that the whole cooperative idea of society. So both, in my experience, both the Catholic and Protestant traditions in Canada support looking at the implications of faith for political and economic decisions. I've just recently read Bill Blakey's book called The Blakey Report. Bill Blakey has been for 32 years an NDP member from Winnipeg, Transcona, and he was Speaker of the House for some time before he retired. And he's just written a book about his experiences. You might like to get it. It's quite fun. And he says in it, nobody ever even raised a question that I was an ordained United Church minister and also a member of Parliament for 32 years. And yeah, maybe my politics were too bland. But he had many things to say about the implications of faith for the gap between the rich and the poor, the lack of proper housing, and so on and so forth. So faith is a perspective on what public policy should be about, I think. So when you become a politician, I think you carry you carry your faith into the new arena. Of course, if your faith means anything, you don't just shed it, but you have to figure out what you're going to do with it then. Because once you get into politics, you discover that it's about compromise, it's about negotiation, it's about living in a pluralistic society with people whose views are quite different from your own. And if you should represent them, then what are you going to do? It's a real dilemma. I think that it's a good thing that in Canada no religious group can form a political party, but it's also a good thing that faith informs political decisions and economic decisions. Otherwise, what's it for? When I was in the Senate, some of the things that we had to look at, I had no idea how to vote on them, so I depended on whatever the ethical issue was. I would take that. So on transportation, I mean, what did I know about transportation? But my rule of thumb was whatever suits most people in terms of ease of access and cost and so on, that's what I'll vote for in terms of transportation reform. We had one interesting bill on the extradition of criminals to the USA who have the death penalty. And I remember that there were only 7 of us in the Senate who said we are against extraditing this guy to the States, although he's a convicted criminal for murder, because if we do, we know he'll get executed. And they voted us down. But we were vindicated a little later when the Supreme Court supported our decision. So there's things like that come up too. We faced the Clarity Act under Chrétien, where if Quebec decides to get out of Confederation, it has to answer this question. And he had carefully crafted the question. And that was a big fight. And it was about, some of my colleagues thought, no, we should vote against it because don't forget minority rights, and they are a minority. And so the minority rights against clarity of just what is it they're trying to do. The whole issue of Aboriginal people, of course, came up time and time again. Nothing much was done, but it did come up. I think in the political area, one has to use secular language. To use faith language, the words are not understood. I mean, they're not very much understood in the faith community either, are they? Like salvation, redemption, sin, all that stuff. Nobody understands what they are. But particularly in the secular field, you can't use that kind of language and be understood at all or carry any clout. So we live then in a pluralistic society with many different faiths now, particularly in Canada. And the fastest growing group are the people of no faith, who would say they're agnostics or atheists, and who claim equal say. And that's in keeping with our democratic principles. So what does one do there? Well, those are some of the things I wanted to say. I've got a few more because my time is beginning to run out, I see. What do you do in a situation if you were a member of Parliament, though, and something came up that your conscience disallowed, or your church was against the party policy? One of the things that drove me mad was parties in Ottawa. I mean, they just voted like trained seals, you know. Literally, the Liberals would hold their nose like this and vote. And finally, I went to them and said, "Would you mind telling me what holds you together? Why do you do this when I know you don't believe in it?" Well, they said, "If we don't, we won't get appointed to a committee, or we won't be a chair of a committee or something." I thought, my goodness, what small aims you have in life. But the party discipline is very strong, and they used to lobby me. I negotiated with Chrétien to be as an independent, because I said I'm a Christian minister, and so I've never joined a political party because I have people of all stripes in my congregation. And he said, "Oh, we don't appoint independents." So I said, "Well, thank you very much. It was a nice idea. Bye." And then 3 days later, they phoned me back and said, actually, he would consider it. But then he got on the line and he said, "Well, but how would you vote?" This is before I'm appointed. How am I supposed to know what I'm going to vote on? How do I know what the issues are? What he was really asking is, you're going to vote Liberal all the time. And at that time I said to him, well, I can't, I find it very difficult to vote with the Conservatives. That was enough for him. But once I got in the Senate, I discovered that there were many, not many, but a number of very progressive Conservatives. Lowell Murray, Noel Kinsella, Myra Spivak. And quite often I voted with the Conservatives. Often wondered what he thought of that. But anyway, it was something that I hadn't known until I got in there. And it broke down all my stereotypes of Conservatives, which was a very good thing for me. Okay, what about the NGO community? Because it also has a huge role in public policy. It's not just the politicians. Again, I found myself when I was in the Senate on the other side of the fence. I'd always been in the NGO community, the churches and secular organizations, petitioning or lobbying or advocating to politicians. Suddenly I was the one who was getting all that. So when I was appointed Canada's envoy to the Sudan, I discovered that Canada's Talisman oil company based in Calgary had a huge oil deposits in southern Sudan. And the profits from that were going to keep the war going. They were going to buy munitions for the north in Sudan, and they were killing people. So there's a huge lobby in Canada right across the country to get Talisman oil out of Sudan. So I was the object of 250 postcards that arrived from Saskatchewan, urging me to please, they were all the same, of course, and it said, get Talisman oil out of Sudan. As if I could do this. This is the first thing. Ridiculous. So anyway, I wrote a letter back to them all, and I said, since you sent me a form postcard, I'm sending you all a form letter back. But if any of you are really interested in talking about the issue, phone me or write me a semi-intelligent letter, and I would be glad to discuss it with you. So I got 2 replies out of the 250. One of them was an excellent one from Regina, which resulted in my going to Regina, meeting with 250 people, including the Sudanese community, and there was a lot more understanding when we finished that. So I've never been a fan of postcard campaigns, and that convinced me that that's not a very good way of proceeding. In the Bible there are 2 ways that powers that we were influenced. One was by opposition. The other was by speaking in the ear of the king and getting next to the king. And some of the prophets did that. That's a wise way to go. So it isn't always by being against something, but there's always it's endless cups of coffee getting to know somebody, but then being able to influence them. And I think we should bear that in mind. Yeah, we face some difficult things. I mean, Sharia law in Ontario was another one. Do you remember that? When the Liberal government were going to bring in Sharia law? Well, my experience with Sharia law had been mainly in Sudan with women who had got out of Sudan to flee Sharia law. But it was only the family part of it that they couldn't abide. Apparently, the Sharia law is quite complicated, and some of it is very, very good, and it's grown up over the centuries. But the part about family law, these women were objecting to. So when it came to Ontario, I wasn't quite sure what to do. By this time, I was out of the Senate. I was an ordinary person again. But I thought I should act on this. So what I did was, I've been very active in the interfaith community, so I phoned one of my Muslim female friends living in Edmonton. And I said, help, what should I do about this? She says, you should write a letter to the Globe and Mail with a question. Which of the 5 interpretations of Shia law are you going to go for? Signed, Lois Wilson. So I did. And my sister-in-law phoned me from Ottawa and said, I didn't know you knew that much about Sharia law. I said, I don't know anything about it. But apparently I've learned a lot since, because there are 5 schools of Sharia law. So for the provincial government just to say we're going to have Sharia law says nothing to any of us. And what was pointed for me was my abysmal ignorance of that whole area and my dependence upon Muslim women who really know it well. So that's another way that faith communities can work together, by getting to know each other, trusting each other. So when questions like that do come up that you don't know anything about, but you are in the dominant, more influential position, you can ask for advice and go with it. But that was quite fun. One of the tricky things, though, I guess, is if you're an elected person, and supposing that it's about abortion, and what would you do there, or what about gay marriage, and those things, the sexual areas seem to be the main areas of disagreement. We don't seem to have many big fights about the growing gap between the rich and the poor, for some reason. The environment is a divisive topic. And I know that there's an interfaith initiative on that one now, but we're moving very, very slowly on it, extremely slowly. And we need to move a lot faster.